Imagine this. It's 1974. French government officials are standing at an airport, waiting. A plane lands, the doors open, and they roll out. A coffin, but this is no ordinary coffin. Inside it is a man who died over 3,000 years ago. A man who was already ancient history when Jesus was born, when Rome was still a village, when the pyramids were considered old. And here's the part nobody talks about. That mummy had a valid Egyptian passport, with his occupation listed as king. His name was Ramesses II, and this is the story of the most powerful human being who ever lived, and what that power actually cost him, to understand why this man was so important that modern France literally received him as a head of state. We need to go back, way back. BC. Egypt is the most powerful civilization on earth. The Nile feeds 5 million people. Armies from every direction fear Egyptian bronze. And the temples make every other structure on the planet look like a child's toy. And into this world, a 20-year-old prince just became its king. His father, Seti I, had already made Egypt powerful. But Ramesses had something different, something that his father never had. He didn't just want to rule Egypt, he wanted to be remembered, forever, by everyone, until the end of time itself, and he was willing to do absolutely anything to make that happen. Within his first decade as Pharaoh, he launched one of the largest military campaigns in ancient history. 20,000 soldiers across the Sinai Desert into modern-day Syria, marching straight toward the one enemy, powerful enough to stop him, the Hittites, the only empire on earth that looked at Egypt and didn't flinch. And the battle that followed, the most famous battle of the ancient world, would define Ramesses' entire legacy for reasons he never intended. The Battle of Kadesh. 1274 BC, Ramesses leads his army north with the confidence of a man who has never lost. He's 25 years old. He's a god on earth. He has 20,000 soldiers behind him, and he rides ahead of them. That was his first mistake, because the Hittite king, Immortality II, was smarter than Ramesses gave him credit for. 2. Hittite soldiers were captured by Egyptian scouts, and they talked. They told Ramesses exactly what he wanted to hear, that the Hittite army was still far away, near the city of Aleppo, days of march from Kadesh. Ramesses believed them. He rode ahead with only his personal guard, leaving the main army far behind, and set up camp near Kadesh, thinking he had arrived first. And hadn't. Those 2 soldiers were not captured. They were planted. And the moment Ramesses' advanced camp was isolated from his army, 2,500 Hittite war chariots came from everywhere at once. They didn't charge from one direction. They came from the flanks, from behind, from across the river. The Egyptian camp exploded into chaos in minutes. Soldiers ran. Officers disappeared. Ramesses looked around, and his army, his 20,000 men, were gone. He was surrounded with a handful of guards against thousands of Hittite chariots. What happened next is one of history's greatest mysteries, because the only source we have for what happened next was written by Ramesses himself, according to his own account. Carved on the walls of 5 different temples, he charged alone into the Hittite forces. He called upon the god Amun, and Amun answered him with divine strength. He personally broke through the encirclement. He fought off hundreds of enemies single-handedly. He turned the battle around by sheer force of godlike will. Modern historians read this and raise an eyebrow. What we actually know is this. The rest of the Egyptian army eventually arrived. The battle continued. And by nightfall, neither side had won. The Hittites held Kadesh. The Egyptians survived. Both armies went home. It was, by any honest military analysis, a stalemate. But Ramesses went home and covered every temple wall in Egypt with carvings of his glorious, divine, single-handed victory at Kadesh. He didn't rewrite history. He carved it in stone, and here's the thing, it worked. For 3,000 years, people read those carvings and believed him. It was only when modern archaeologists found the Hittite records of the same battle, telling a very different story, that the truth started to emerge. Ramesses II was not just a warrior. He was the greatest propaganda machine the ancient world ever produced, but Kadesh was just the beginning. Over. The next 60 years, Ramesses built more. Always more. Abu Simbel, 4 colossal statues of himself carved directly into a mountain cliff, each one 20 meters tall, engineered so that twice a year the rising sun travels 60 meters through the interior corridor and illuminates his face while the god of darkness beside him stays in shadow. He made the sun itself serve him. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, so vast that when Percy Shelley saw its ruins 3,000 years later, he wrote his most famous poem about it. You probably know the line. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Pi Ramesses, an entire capital city built from scratch and named after himself. A city of 300,000 people, built to say, I was here. He also signed the world's first known peace treaty. With the Hittites, the same people he'd fought at Kadesh. The treaty was written in both Egyptian and Hittite, and copies survive to this day. The United Nations has a replica hanging in their headquarters in New York, a 3,300-year-old contract. Still on the wall. He had somewhere between 200 and 300 wives and concubines. He fathered more than 100 children. He was, in every measurable way, trying to fill the future with himself. And then, something remarkable happened. He didn't die. He turned 50. Then 60. Then 70. His eldest son died. Then his second son. Then his third. His generals, who had fought beside him at Kadesh, were dead. His wives grew old and were replaced. The scribes who had first written his name in gold were dust. Ramesses kept going. He turned 80. Egypt had never seen anything like it. Pharaohs weren't supposed to live this long. The divine order of Egypt depended on regular succession, the old god king dying, the new god king rising. But Ramesses refused to cooperate with the natural order. By the time he finally died, at roughly 90 years old, he had outlived 12 of his chosen heirs, 12 sons who were supposed to be king, dead before their father. The people of Egypt had grown up knowing only one pharaoh. Their parents had known only one pharaoh. Some of their grandparents had known only one pharaoh. He had stopped being a person. He had become a feature of the landscape. Like the Nile, like the desert, like the sky, something that had simply always been there and was assumed to always be there. But nothing lasts forever. Not even Ramesses II. After Ramesses died, Egypt began to fracture. The empire he had held together through sheer force of personality and power started coming apart. Invasions from the sea peoples, mysterious raiders no one could stop, droughts that the Nile floods no longer fixed, priests accumulating power that should have belonged to kings, internal corruption, weakening borders. The civilization that had existed for 2,000 years before Ramesses began its slow unraveling in the centuries after him. And many historians believe that Ramesses himself was partly responsible, that by ruling for 67 years without developing strong successors, he left Egypt without the leadership it needed to survive what came next. The greatest ruler Egypt ever had may also have been one of the reasons Egypt eventually fell. His mummy was buried in the Valley of the Kings in a tomb filled with gold, painted walls, and everything a god king would need for the afterlife. Then tomb robbers came, priests, moved him, then moved him again, then hid him in a secret cache in a cliff with the mummies of 50 other pharaohs, all the greatest rulers of Egypt, hidden together for protection, and then he was simply lost. For nearly 700 years, no one knew where Ramesses II was, until 1881, when an Egyptian family who had been secretly selling antiquities led archaeologists to the cache, and there he was, the most powerful man in ancient history, wrapped in linen, intact after nearly 3,000 years. When scientists finally examined his mummy properly in the 20th century, here's what they found. Severe arthritis in his spine, so advanced that by his final years he could not stand up. Straight, the man who carved himself standing tall over fallen. Enemies couldn't stand without pain. Dental, disease so extreme it had caused chronic infections that shortened his final years. The god who commanded armies was undone by his teeth. Evidence of old battle wounds healed decades before his death, scattered across his skeleton. The body of a man who had been physically broken and repaired over 90 years of living harder than any person should. And then there's 1974. His mummy had begun deteriorating. Fungal growth was attacking the ancient linen. Egypt didn't have the technology to treat it properly, so they made a decision that sounds impossible until you remember who this man was. They issued him a passport, an official Egyptian government passport, with his photograph, taken of his mummy, and his occupation listed as king, deceased. And because he was officially still a head of state of Egypt, but even a dead one, France received him with full diplomatic protocol. A military honor guard stood at attention on the Paris tarmac. A formal state ceremony was conducted. Officials from both governments were present. A man who had been dead for 3,200 years was welcomed to France. With the same honors given to living presidents and kings, the French scientists treated his fungal infection. And then Egypt took him home. Ramesses II spent his entire life trying to become immortal. He built more than any human before him. He fought battles and then rewrote the ones he didn't win.